snow covered the forest floor like a funeral veil. A mother tiger lay lifeless near a rock, her cubs whimpering in the cold. Out of the trees stepped a dog, just a dog. But what he did next would unravel grief, rebuild a broken family, and stir a town that had forgotten what it meant to believe. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The morning broke over Snowpine Valley, Montana, with a silence only winter could command. Snow lay thick across the ground, untouched and glistening like powdered glass under the gray light. Pines bowed under the weight of the storm from the night before, their branches stiff with frost. The sky was a pale slate, the kind that promised more snow, and the cold sliced through the air like a blade in a small wooden cabin tucked into the forest's edge. A fire smoldered behind frosted windows. Inside slept a man and his dog, the man, Walter Gaines, 70 years old and mostly forgotten by the world. The dog, Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd with eyes like smoke and a gait like silence. Walter had once been a respected veterinarian, traveling across counties to save everything from white-tailed deer to eagles tangled in fence wire, now retired. He lived alone in this cabin far from town, with only memories and routines to mark his days, tall and weathered like the trees outside. Walter wore his solitude like an old coat, comforting, familiar, and stitched with loss. Since the passing of his wife 5 winters ago, he'd turned his back on the world, but he hadn't turned away from Shadow. Shadow was more than a dog. He was Walter's guardian, his quiet companion, and the only soul who moved freely between the weight of the past and the pulse of the present, with a sleek, black and sable coat, strong limbs, and an uncanny alertness. Shadow seemed made from the forest itself, part shadow, part breath. Always watching, that morning. Something stirred in him. He stood by the cabin door, ears perked, nose twitching toward the woods beyond. The air carried something foreign, a scent that didn't belong. Blood, fear, something raw and urgent, without a sound. Shadow pushed open the half-latched door with his snout and stepped out into the snow. Walter didn't stir. The fire crackled faintly as Shadow vanished into the forest. The dog's paws pressed deep into the snow as he moved through the underbrush, following the trail invisible to all but him, over logs, under icy branches, through narrow animal paths he had walked 100 times before. Only now, he was led by instinct, a scent woven with danger, sorrow, and something else, helplessness. Half an hour passed before he reached the edge of a low rock formation, partially buried under drifts of snow. The wind had died down here. The silence was eerie. That's when he saw her. A large tigress lay crumpled at the base of the rocks, her fur streaked with snow and blood. Her ribs no longer rose, her golden eyes, open but glazed, stared past the trees. The wound along her side had frozen over, but there was no life left in her body. Shadow stepped closer, ears back, tail low. He sniffed. Death had come recently. Then he heard it, a faint cry, high-pitched, weak, and desperate. He looked to the tigress's side. Pressed into her still warm body were 4 tiny cubs, barely larger than house cats, their striped fur damp and clinging to their skin. They were newborns, no more than a day old, eyes shut, limbs trembling, noses buried into fur that no longer gave milk. Shadow froze. The cubs were dying. There was no one else, no hope but the cold, no help but him. He stepped forward, gently nosing the smallest cub. It twitched, then gave another faint cry. Shadow tilted his head. then did what only instinct could justify. He grasped the cub by the scruff of its neck, turned, and began the long journey back through the snow. One by one, he carried them, 4 trips, over logs, through wind, across the thinning day, each time. He returned to the body of the tigress, his breath shorter, his limbs heavier, but his resolve unshaken. And each time, he returned to the cabin with a cub held gently in his mouth, placing it on the old wool blanket that lay near the fireplace inside. By the time the last cub was placed down, curled into the warmth of its siblings, the light outside had dimmed to silver. Snow fell again in soft flurries. The sky deepened to blue-gray. The cabin stood still and quiet, a cradle of heat in the frozen woods. Inside, 4 tiger cubs lay in a trembling huddle, and beside them, Shadow stood like a statue, silent, alert, guarding what fate had delivered to him, a shadow in the snow. Now the bearer of something wild, something sacred. The scent of milk and smoke mingled in the wooden cabin as the fire hissed against the rising wind outside. Walter Gaines stood barefoot in his flannel pajamas, staring down at the 4 striped bundles curled into a heap of trembling fur on the old blanket by the hearth. His hands, still strong though lined with veins and age spots, trembled slightly as he adjusted the kettle on the stove. The room, once a quiet fortress of solitude, now pulsed with unexpected life. Shadow sat nearby, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on Walter. There was no bark, no whimper, only the quiet demand of his presence. It was clear. Shadow had done what he believed was right. Now. The next move was Walter's. He knelt slowly beside the cubs, heart thudding in a way it hadn't in years. Each cub was breathing, shallow but steady. Their fur, though matted and damp, was beginning to fluff with warmth from the fire. The smallest one shuddered, let out a faint cry, and instinctively moved toward Walter's hand as if sensing a gentler world. "What am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered. "You're not kittens, you're predators." But even as he said it, he was already reaching for the drawer beneath the sink, the one where he kept his old syringes, gauze, and thermometer strips from the days he used to make house calls with nothing but a metal case and a fierce will to heal. Walter sighed. God help me. That afternoon, he fashioned a makeshift den out of a wooden crate, lined it with towels warmed on the stove, and used a baby bottle filled with diluted goat milk to begin feeding. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The cubs latched on with desperate need, each pull on the rubber nipple tugging at Walter's weathered heartstrings. Just after dusk, a knock echoed through the cabin, soft, hesitant. Walter looked up, startled. Few people ever came this far into the woods, especially during the first real snow of the season. He opened the door to reveal a small figure wrapped in a heavy tan coat, too large for her tiny frame. The hood was lined with faux fur, and 2 wide eyes blinked up at him through thick-rimmed glasses. Emily Walter blinked. The girl nodded, saying nothing. Emily Walker, 11 years old, was his nearest neighbor, though near in Snowpine terms meant a 15-minute walk through trees and powder. She was small for her age, with pale skin that seemed to absorb winter's light and soft brown hair, often tucked under a wool cap. Her movements were cautious, her voice rarely heard. After her mother died in a car crash 2 years prior, Emily had gone nearly silent. The doctors called it selective mutism, brought on by trauma. Walter called it heartbreak. She clutched a basket in gloved hands and held it out to him. Inside were 2 loaves of cornbread wrapped in cloth. "My father said to bring these," she said quietly, eyes flicking to the side. Walter took the basket and stepped aside. "You want to come in a minute?" "Warm up," Emily hesitated. Then, with a small nod, She stepped over the threshold. The warmth of the fire greeted her, along with the gentle, unfamiliar sounds of rustling cloth and tiny animal breath. As soon as her eyes landed on the crate near the hearth, she froze. Walter waited. Emily moved slowly forward, drawn in. She knelt beside the crate, pulling off her gloves. One cub lifted its head and yawned. Another let out a sleepy chirp. "Are they tigers?" she whispered. Walter chuckled softly. "Sure are. Shadow found them." She glanced at the dog, who wagged his tail once and sat beside her. Her hand hovered just over the smallest cub, and her fingers trembled before resting gently on its fur. "They're warm," she said. "They weren't this morning." Emily's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close, for a moment. The silence between them felt less like absence and more like peace. Walter watched her. She was a quiet girl, but her presence settled something in the room. The lines in his forehead eased. "You can visit them if you'd like. Might be good for them. And you too." She didn't reply, but she didn't leave either, that night. After Emily had gone and the cabin had fallen back into quiet, Walter sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand. He was making a list. Milk, feeding syringes, heat lamp bulbs, items he hadn't needed in years. It felt strange to be planning again, to have something fragile depending on him. Shadow came and sat beside him, resting his head against Walter's leg. The fire crackled outside. The wind began to howl again. Walter looked down at the dog. "You brought them to me. Now, I've got to find the strength to keep them alive." And he would. He didn't know how yet, but he would. The smell of warm milk and pinewood smoke lingered in the air of Walter's cabin. The days had grown longer, but the snow outside still clung to every branch and rooftop, turning the valley into a frozen world where time moved slower. Inside the cabin, however, life moved with a kind of beautiful chaos. The 4 tiger cubs had grown stronger with each passing day. Their eyes had opened wide, gold-rimmed orbs that blinked curiously at the firelight and the world around them. Their legs, once wobbly, were finding strength. They stumbled over each other like drunken dancers, tumbling into blankets, paws oversized for their tiny frames. Walter had named them for practical reasons. Red, the firstborn and boldest; Ash, with a darker coat; Willow, the smallest and gentlest; and Bran, who liked to bite everything in sight. Shadow had become more than a guardian. He was now a father in every sense. The shepherd licked their fur clean after feedings, lay curled around them during afternoon naps, and barked softly when one of them wandered too far across the cabin floor. He guided them like a patient teacher, nudging them upright when they fell, even growling lightly when they tried chewing his tail. Emily visited every day, the girl, once locked away in silence, now sat cross-legged by the crate with her sketch pad open. Her hands moved constantly, fingers blackened with charcoal dust. She drew them endlessly, red climbing onto Shadow's back. Willow curled into Walter's slipper. The 4 of them nuzzled together like puzzle pieces. She had never spoken more than a few words before meeting the cubs. Now, she whispered names, narrated their antics to herself, even laughed out loud when Bran pounced into the food bowl. Walter noticed the change but didn't mention it. Some healing, he believed, bloomed better in silence. One afternoon, while Emily knelt in the corner with her sketch pad, a knock came at the cabin door, loud, abrupt, jarring. Walter opened it to find a man in a tan wool coat dusted with snow. He had sharp features, a square jaw under a trimmed beard, and wore a deputy's badge on his chest. His name was Tom Halder. a local rancher turned sheriff's deputy after losing his land 2 years ago in a wildfire. At 38, he was known for being direct but fair. A man with clear rules and little patience for strange happenings in the woods. "Afternoon, Walter," Tom said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Afternoon," Walter replied slowly, stepping aside. Tom didn't enter. His gaze wandered to the hearth behind Walter's shoulder, where a striped tail flicked once into view. "We had a call," Tom said, from a hunter passing through the trail near Hollow Rock. Said he saw what looked like tiger tracks. 4 of them. Walter said nothing. He looked calm, but his heart was hammering. "Now, that seems unlikely," Tom continued. "But the same man said he saw a big shepherd dragging something into the woods the same day. Thought it was odd. Lot of strange stories float through this valley," Walter muttered. Tom gave him a long look. "Yeah, but not many involve endangered species being raised in old cabins." A soft whimper sounded behind Walter. Tom looked past him again. One of the cubs, Ash, had wandered toward the door, blinking up at the visitor with no fear. Behind him, Shadow appeared, standing guard. Tom's face tightened. "Jesus," he said, "they're real." Walter exhaled. "They're orphans. Shadow found them beside their dead mother. I didn't have it in me to let them freeze. They belong in a wildlife facility. They wouldn't have survived the trip. And by now, they've bonded with the dog, with Emily, with me." Tom took off his gloves. His voice softened slightly. "Walter, I don't doubt your heart. But we're talking about apex predators. You can't keep them here forever. I don't plan to," Walter said, "but they deserve a chance to grow before they're caged from the corner." Emily stood up, her sketch pad pressed to her chest. Her eyes met Tom's. She didn't speak, but the message was clear in her face. "Please, don't take them." Tom looked between the girl, the cubs, and the old man. Then he rubbed a hand over his beard. "I'll tell the office it was a false alarm," he said finally. "But this buys you time, not immunity, if someone else finds out." "I know," Walter said, nodding as Tom turned to leave. He paused at the step. "If you need help, building a pen or supplies, I can spare some hands." Walter raised a brow. "You'd help me." "I know what loss feels like," Tom said. "I lost my wife and my ranch the same month. And I've seen what this place does to people when they've got nothing left to love." He left without another word. Inside, the cubs resumed their play. Shadow chased Bran gently in a circle. Emily returned to her drawings, adding a new figure to the page. A man with a badge, standing in the snow. Walter looked around the room. This strange, unlikely family under one roof, and felt something rare in his chest. Hope. The frost lingered longer now, clinging to windows until midday. Inside Walter's cabin, the scent of straw, warm milk, and wood smoke filled every corner. 4 tiger cubs, now steady on their feet and full of energy, turned the living space into a jungle of their own, leaping over couch pillows, wrestling in corners, and curling up together near the stove when exhaustion finally won. Walter had reinforced the walls with thick boards, and even cleared a space in the shed out back for a more permanent enclosure, with Tom Halder's quiet help. A wire mesh pen had been built beside the cabin, roomy, warm, and partially roofed to shield against snow. It was his way of preparing for what he hoped wouldn't come, but deep down, he knew better. It came on a Tuesday. A white government truck pulled up the long, snowy trail around noon. Its tires crunched over ice, and the engine echoed like a warning in the stillness. Shadow barked before they even knocked. Walter opened the door to find 2 people stepping out. A tall woman with a clipboard and kind, assessing eyes, and a younger man following close behind, holding a camera. "Mr. Gaines," the woman asked, voice firm but not unkind. "My name is Diane Lorenz. With the Western Wildlife Conservation Authority, this is Evan Clay, our documentation officer." Diane stood at least 6 feet tall, with graying red hair pulled into a tight braid. Her face was lined with both experience and stress, but her eyes held patience. She wore a thick green parka with the agency's patch stitched on the shoulder, and sturdy snow boots that had seen miles of terrain. Evan, in contrast, was thin, wiry, and younger than 30, with thick glasses and a face that tried to look confident but kept flickering with nerves. He carried his camera like a shield. "We received a call and a report," Diane continued, "from someone who confirmed the presence of 4 non-native felines in this residence." Walter's face was calm, though his heart had already dropped into his boots. "Come in," he said, inside. The cubs were napping in their crate by the stove. Emily, who had come early that morning with a new sketch, sat cross-legged on the floor beside them. She looked up when the strangers entered, her small frame stiffening. Diane paused when she saw the cubs. She moved forward slowly, kneeling beside them, watching as Red yawned and blinked at her. "Unafraid. They're healthy," she murmured, "which means someone's been doing something right." Evan began taking photos, quietly. Emily hugged her sketch pad tighter. "We understand why you took them in," Diane said gently, turning to Walter, "but they're protected animals. Even hand-reared, they pose risks, not just to you, but to your neighbors and the ecosystem." "They're not ready," Walter replied, his voice even. "They still need bottle feeds. They still sleep under the stove. And they trust us. They're not pets." Mr. Gaines. "No," he agreed. "They're family." Emily stood up for a moment. She said nothing. Then, to everyone's surprise, she spoke. "You can't take them," she said. Her voice small but steady. Diane looked over, surprised. Walter was frozen. Emily continued. "They're not wild anymore. They're safe here. Shadow raised them. We all did." Diane knelt to her level. "What's your name?" "Sweetheart, Emily Walker," she answered. "And I haven't talked to strangers in 2 years, but I'm talking now, because they matter." Evan lowered his camera slowly. Diane straightened and looked at Walter. "We've had people try to raise wild animals before. It ends badly, most of the time. This isn't most of the time," he said. Silence settled between them. The wind outside whispered through the trees like distant voices. Diane took a breath. "We have a policy, but we also have discretion. If you're willing to meet certain conditions, we may consider a temporary care extension." "What kind of conditions?" "A secure enclosure, regular veterinary check-ins, limited public access, and eventually, a transition plan." Walter hesitated. Evan finally spoke up. Softly, "There's something here, a bond. Maybe we shouldn't break it." Diane nodded slowly. "You'll need to sign papers, and you'll be listed under observation. But for now, they stay." Walter exhaled, only realizing then how long he'd been holding his breath. Emily's eyes welled, but she smiled, something rare and radiant. Shadow wagged his tail as if understanding the conversation. By sunset, the officials had left, and the cubs were back in their playpen, bathed in the glow of the fire. Walter looked around the cabin, this strange cradle of miracles, and shook his head. 4 stripes, 1 roof, and, for now, 1 more chance. Spring arrived in Snowpine Valley like a promise fulfilled. The pines shed their heavy coats of snow, and soft green shoots pushed through earth that had slept for months. Birds returned to the branches, and sunlight lingered longer on the porch of Walter Gaines' cabin, no longer just a home, but now something more. What had once been a simple backyard, flanked by fence posts and old garden tools, was now a carefully built enclosure bordered with cedar planks and reinforced steel mesh. A hand-carved sign hung at the entrance. Shadow's Den, a place for wonder. The letters were painted in Emily's careful strokes, each one outlined with tiger stripes inside the pen. 4 young tigers bounded through the grass, no longer cubs, not yet full-grown. Red, the leader, had a confident gait and striking eyes. Ash still lingered in shadows, alert and thoughtful. Willow remained the gentlest, always curling near people's feet, and Bran, ever mischievous, enjoyed knocking over water bowls and chasing his own tail at the far corner of the yard, under the cool shade of a pine tree, lay Shadow. His fur had taken on more silver around the muzzle, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He watched the tigers play with quiet contentment, his tail thumping gently against the earth. He had raised them, protected them, and now he let them fly. Today marked the first time the sanctuary opened its gates to the public, specifically to children across the valley. Walter had been hesitant at first, but the Conservation Board had encouraged it. Sharing the story of love and survival could do more than raise awareness. It could spark something in hearts not yet closed by fear. Emily stood at the gate in a bright yellow jacket, clipboard in hand. At 13 now, she had grown taller, and though still shy in crowds, her eyes were bright and steady. Her hair was tied into a loose ponytail, and her sketches, now compiled into a small booklet, were stacked in a basket by the welcome table as the first group of children arrived, escorted by a young schoolteacher named Miss Riley Monroe. Emily stepped forward. Riley was in her late 20s, petite with fiery curls and a contagious laugh. She had moved to Snowpine just a year ago after leaving the city behind, seeking peace and meaning. Her students adored her because she treated them like equals, often kneeling to their height when speaking, and never letting her smile fade even when life's storms threatened to dampen it. "Everyone, stay close together," Riley called out, guiding the children forward. "This isn't the zoo. Okay, it's better." Emily took a deep breath, then spoke loud enough for the group to hear. "Welcome to Shadow's Den," she said. "This is where Wild became family. The children, a dozen in all, ages between 6 and 10, leaned forward as she led them to the fence where the tigers were already curiously watching. One of the girls, small and freckled, gasped as Willow padded closer and sat just on the other side, her golden eyes blinking slowly. "Are they dangerous?" a boy asked, clutching Riley's sleeve. "Only if you're a chicken nugget," Riley joked, which made the entire group giggle. Emily knelt beside them, pointing to each tiger by name. She told them how they had been found, how Shadow had raised them, and how Walter had built their home by hand. Her voice was clear and steady. There was no tremor now, no hesitation. She wasn't hiding behind silence anymore. Inside the cabin, Walter stood by the window, watching. He wore his cleanest flannel. Though he still had sawdust on his sleeves from the morning's fence repair, his face was weathered, but his expression was peaceful. He turned when he heard steps behind him. It was Tom Halder, the deputy who had once knocked on the door to end it all. Now, he stood with a paper coffee cup and a folder of paperwork. His beard was a little thicker, but he looked more at ease than he had in years. "I brought the final permit approvals," Tom said. "You're officially sanctioned for public learning visits, quarterly checks, but otherwise you're free to run this how you see fit." Walter chuckled. "You sure the world's ready for tigers in a backyard?" Tom smiled. "No, but it seems they're exactly where they belong. Outside." A shout of laughter rose as Bran launched into the air and landed in a heap of fur beside Red. Shadow stood and stretched, then walked slowly to the children. Pressing his nose gently to the fence, Emily introduced him as their father. The children clapped. That afternoon, as the children colored tiger masks and listened to Emily read aloud from her illustrated booklet, a quiet joy settled over the yard. Riley handed Walter a cup of hot cider and joined him by the fence. "You built something here," she said. "No," Walter replied, watching Emily laugh as Bran nuzzled her shoulder through the wire. "It built itself. I just didn't stop it." As the sun lowered, casting a golden glow across the trees, the last child waved goodbye. Emily stood beside Shadow, her hand on his back, while the tigers rolled playfully behind her. 4 stripes, 1 dog, 1 girl who found her voice, and an old man whose hands remembered how to save the world, 1 heartbeat at a time. Sometimes. The greatest miracles come not with thunder or lightning, but in the quiet choice to love something the world says you shouldn't. A shepherd dog raising tigers, a grieving girl finding her voice, an old man choosing to hope again. None of it makes sense by logic alone, but perhaps that's how God works, not always in the way we expect, but in the way we need most, in a world that often rushes past what's broken. This story reminds us to slow down and see the divine in the small things, in warmth shared, in wounds tended, in families found, not born. So if this story touched your heart, take a moment to thank God for the quiet blessings in your own life. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment below and say Amen if you believe love can cross every boundary, and if you'd like to see more stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe, and may God bless you and your family always. Type Amen in the comments if you believe miracles are still real.